When did the friend who lied to our parents for years finally tell them the truth? Julian called my parents on a Sunday morning in November and told them everything we'd been doing for the past 4 years. I was still asleep when my bedroom door flew open and my father stood there with his phone in one hand and keys in the other, his face a color I'd never seen before. He said Julian just confessed that every weekend trip, every study session, every late night at his house had been a lie, that we'd been breaking into vacant vacation homes along the coast and throwing parties, selling drugs to other kids, destroying property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that Julian had been covering for us since we were 16 years old. My father's voice shook when he said the police were already at Julian's house and would be coming here next. I sat up in bed trying to understand what he was saying. Julian had been my best friend since 7th grade. He was the kid every parent in our town trusted completely, the one with perfect grades and a full scholarship to Stanford starting next fall. He came from the kind of family that hosted church dinners and volunteered at the food bank. When my parents asked where I was going on Friday nights, I said Julian's house to study. When Caleb's mom called checking on him, Julian answered his landline and confirmed we were all there working on a group project. When Mira's dad wanted to know why she was out past curfew, Julian explained we'd lost track of time studying for the SAT. Julian had been our alibi for everything. Every party we threw in someone else's mansion while they were away for the winter. Every bag of pills we sold in the school parking lot. Every window we smashed. Every wall we spray painted. Every piece of furniture we destroyed because we were drunk and bored and thought consequences were for other people. Julian vouched for us every single time. He had a clean record, a trustworthy face, and parents who believed their son would never lie to them. So when he told other parents we were studying at his house, they believed him without question. When he gave us alibis for the nights we got questioned by police about break-ins along Ocean View Drive, the cops believed him too. Nobody suspected that the straight-A student with the Stanford acceptance letter was systematically lying to cover for 4 friends who were spiraling into increasingly criminal behavior. I got dressed in a daze while my father called our lawyer, a man named Gregory Vaughn, who handled business disputes for my father's company, but had never dealt with anything like this. My mother sat at the kitchen table crying when I came downstairs. She kept asking how long this had been going on, how many times I'd lied to her, whether anything I'd told her in the past 4 years was true. I didn't have good answers. The doorbell rang before I could attempt an explanation. 2 police officers stood on our porch, Detective Rita Alvarez and her partner whose name I didn't catch. They asked if they could come in and speak with me about my relationship with Julian Park and my activities over the past several years. Gregory arrived while Detective Alvarez was reading me my rights. He told me not to say anything until he'd consulted with me privately. We went into my father's study, and Gregory asked me to explain exactly what Julian might have told the police. I started talking and realized I couldn't remember all of it. 4 years of criminal activity, dozens of houses we'd broken into, hundreds of people we'd sold drugs to, thousands of dollars in property damage. Julian had covered for all of it, and I'd never once considered that he might stop. Gregory's expression got darker with each detail I provided. When I finished, he said I was looking at serious felony charges, possibly years in prison, depending on what the prosecutors could prove. He asked if there was any evidence linking me to specific incidents. I said I didn't know. We'd been careful, or so I thought. But Julian knew everything. Every house we'd hit, every party we'd thrown, every transaction we'd made. He'd been there for most of it, not participating but present, watching us destroy things and hurt people while he stood by with the perfect alibi ready. Gregory went back out to speak with Detective Alvarez, while I sat in my father's chair trying to process the scope of what was happening. My phone started buzzing with messages. Caleb sent a string of texts asking what the hell was going on, saying cops had shown up at his house too. Mira called crying, saying her parents were talking about sending her to live with relatives in another state. Our 4th member, Dylan, didn't respond at all. I tried calling Julian and got sent straight to voicemail. I wanted to know why he'd done this. Why now, after 4 years of covering for us, after becoming so essential to our operation that we couldn't function without him? What had changed? What had finally made him break his silence and burn down everything we'd built? The answer came when Detective Alvarez walked back into the study with Gregory following behind her. She said Julian had come forward because a 16-year-old girl named Haley Cross had been found unconscious in her bedroom 3 nights ago from a drug overdose. Haley had bought pills from Dylan at a party 2 weeks prior, pills that turned out to be laced with fentanyl. She was in ICU at County Medical, still unconscious, and her parents had no idea where she'd gotten the drugs, until Julian called them and explained everything. My stomach dropped. I knew Haley vaguely from school, a sophomore who'd started showing up at our parties over the summer. She'd seemed young and naive, exactly the kind of person we should have protected instead of exploited. Dylan had sold to her multiple times, and I'd been there during at least 2 of those transactions, watching him hand over pills he claimed were Adderall but were actually pressed fentanyl he bought from a dealer in the city. We charged twice what they cost us and made hundreds of dollars every weekend. Julian had warned us about selling to younger kids, had said someone was going to get hurt eventually. We'd ignored him and told him to mind his business or stop covering for us if he had such a problem with it. He'd kept quiet and kept providing alibis, until Haley ended up in the hospital, and Julian couldn't live with his silence anymore. Detective Alvarez said Julian had provided detailed statements about our entire operation. Names, dates, locations, transaction records he'd kept on his phone. He'd been documenting everything for months, taking photos of houses we'd broken into, recording videos of us partying and selling drugs. Apparently he'd planned to go to the police before, but had convinced himself we'd stop on our own. When Haley overdosed, he realized we were never going to stop unless someone forced us to. I asked Gregory what this meant for me legally. He said with Julian's testimony and the evidence he'd provided, the prosecution would have no trouble convicting me on multiple felony charges: breaking and entering, property destruction, drug trafficking, contributing to the delinquency of a minor. I was 18, would be tried as an adult. The sentencing guidelines for drug trafficking alone carried mandatory minimums of several years. Combined with everything else, I could be looking at a decade or more in prison. My mother made a sound from the doorway that I'd never heard before, something between a sob and a gasp. My father put his arm around her and they both stared at me, waiting for me to say something that would make this less terrible. I had nothing. Every excuse I could think of sounded hollow and pathetic. We'd been doing this for fun, for the thrill of it, for the money that let us buy things we didn't need. There was no justification that wouldn't make me look like exactly what I was: a spoiled kid who thought he was above consequences, who'd used his best friend's trustworthiness as a shield while committing crimes that hurt real people. Detective Alvarez asked if I'd be willing to make a statement. Gregory immediately said no, that I wouldn't be speaking to police without a formal agreement in place. She nodded and handed him her card, said to call her when I was ready to cooperate, or when I'd been formally charged, whichever came first. After the police left, my parents and I sat in the living room in horrible silence. My mother wanted to know how Julian had been covering for us. I explained his system, how he'd answer calls from our parents confirming we were at his house, how he'd create elaborate stories about study groups and school projects we were supposedly working on together, how he'd memorized all our schedules and our parents' work hours, so he always knew when someone might check on us. My father asked why Julian would do that, why he'd risk his own future to protect us. I said I didn't know, that Julian had always been like that. The helper, the fixer, the person who solved everyone else's problems. His parents were strict and demanding, pushed him constantly to be perfect. Somehow covering for us had become his way of rebelling, of having control over something in his carefully managed life. Except it wasn't rebellion. It was enabling, and it had gotten worse every year as our behavior escalated, and he kept providing cover without ever setting boundaries or telling us to stop. My mother asked if Julian had ever participated in the break-ins or the drug dealing. I said no. He'd always stayed outside or watched from a distance, never entered the houses or handled the drugs. He'd made that clear from the beginning. He'd provide alibis and cover stories, but he wouldn't actively commit crimes himself. That distinction apparently hadn't protected him legally. Gregory called back an hour later and said he'd spoken to the district attorney's office. Julian was being charged as an accessory to multiple felonies because his alibis and cover stories had facilitated our criminal activity for years. The DA was offering him a deal if he testified against the rest of us: reduced charges, probation instead of prison time, and his record could potentially be sealed since he was still 17 when most of this occurred. But he'd have to give complete testimony about everything we'd done and everything he'd helped us get away with. Gregory said Julian had apparently already agreed to the deal. He was cooperating fully, providing evidence, and preparing to testify at our trials. My father asked what our options were for fighting the charges. Gregory said fighting would be nearly impossible given the evidence. Julian had documentation of dozens of incidents. Photos showed us inside houses that weren't ours. Videos showed drug transactions with clear views of our faces. He had text messages where we'd asked him to cover for us, and he'd confirmed the alibis he'd provide. The only real option was to negotiate our own plea deals before this went to trial, which could reduce our sentences, but would still mean prison time. Over the next week, I learned the full scope of what Julian had documented. He'd started keeping records 6 months ago, apparently after we'd broken into a house and destroyed a child's bedroom for no reason except we were drunk and thought it was funny. The homeowners had returned from vacation to find their 7-year-old daughter's room completely trashed. Furniture broken, walls spray-painted, stuffed animals torn apart. The girl had been traumatized, refused to sleep in her room anymore. Julian had been outside that night, had heard us laughing about destroying the kid's stuff, and something had broken in him. He'd started recording everything after that, not to blackmail us or protect himself, but because he'd realized our behavior was getting worse and someone needed to document it before we seriously hurt someone. His worst fears had been confirmed when Haley overdosed. Julian had known Dylan was selling fentanyl-laced pills, but had convinced himself that if he kept covering for us, he could somehow control the damage. That had been delusional thinking, and he knew it. So he'd walked into the police station with his phone full of evidence and confessed to 4 years of lying to parents and authorities. He'd destroyed his own life, along with ours, but at least Haley's parents would know the truth. The charges against me were filed formally on a Thursday morning. 5 counts of breaking and entering, 3 counts of property destruction over $10,000, 2 counts of drug trafficking, one count of contributing to the delinquency of a minor in connection with Haley's overdose. The maximum sentences added up to 38 years. Gregory filed motions and negotiated with prosecutors while my parents mortgaged our house to pay his fees. Caleb's family hired their own attorney. Mira's parents sent her to stay with family in Oregon, trying to get her away from the investigation. Dylan disappeared completely for 3 days before police found him at a motel near the state border. He'd been planning to run, which made his situation significantly worse. The preliminary hearing happened 2 weeks after Julian's confession. I sat in a courtroom for the first time in my life, wearing a suit my mother had bought for college interviews that now served as my defendant's outfit. Julian was called as the prosecution's first witness. He walked to the stand without looking at any of us, his expression completely neutral. He'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping. The prosecutor asked him to explain his relationship with me, Caleb, Mira, and Dylan. Julian described how we'd been friends since middle school, how that friendship had gradually evolved into something toxic, where we took advantage of his trustworthiness to commit crimes. He testified about the first time we'd asked him to lie for us, freshman year of high school, when we'd gone to a party and stayed out past curfew. When my parents called his house looking for me, Julian had said I was sleeping over and we'd been playing video games all night. The lie had worked perfectly, and we'd realized we had a valuable resource in Julian, someone whose parents trusted him completely, whose word carried weight with adults. We'd started using him more frequently, every weekend, every vacation, every time we needed cover for something our parents wouldn't approve of. Julian testified that at first, the lies had been minor, covering for us going to parties or staying out late. But over the years, as we'd gotten more confident, we'd escalated to criminal behavior, breaking into vacation homes that sat empty in the winter, throwing massive parties that destroyed property, stealing alcohol and prescription medications from medicine cabinets, eventually graduating to selling drugs we'd obtained from dealers in the city. He said he'd gone along with it because we were his only real friends, because saying no meant losing the one part of his life that wasn't completely controlled by his demanding parents. He knew it was wrong, knew he should tell someone, but he'd convinced himself that if he kept covering for us, he could somehow keep us from going too far. The prosecutor asked about Haley Cross. Julian's voice cracked when he said Haley's name. He testified that he'd watched Dylan sell pills to her at a party in October, had seen how young she was, how naive. He'd pulled Dylan aside after and told him to stop selling to high school kids, especially ones who were clearly inexperienced with drugs. Dylan had told him to mind his own business or stop covering for us if he had such a problem with it. Julian said he should have stopped covering for us right then, should have gone to the police or told our parents or done anything except continue enabling our behavior. But he'd been scared of losing his friends, scared of his parents finding out he'd been lying to them for years, scared of facing consequences for all the times he'd obstructed justice by providing false alibis. So he'd kept quiet and kept covering for us, right up until Haley ended up in the hospital. When he'd heard about her overdose, he'd known he couldn't live with his silence anymore. That if he didn't tell the truth, someone else would get hurt or killed, and their blood would be on his hands along with ours. The prosecutor showed Julian several photos. He identified them as houses we'd broken into and destroyed. The prosecutor played videos from Julian's phone showing us selling drugs at parties. Julian confirmed the dates, the locations, the people involved in each transaction. My attorney tried to cross-examine Julian, suggesting he'd participated more actively than he claimed. Julian calmly explained that he'd never entered the houses, never touched the drugs, never took money from our sales. He'd been present as a lookout sometimes and had provided alibis afterward, but he'd carefully avoided direct involvement in the actual crimes. That distinction seemed thin to me, sitting there watching him testify. He'd been essential to our operation. Without his cover stories and alibis, we would have been caught within months. His trustworthy reputation and his willingness to lie to anyone who asked had enabled 4 years of escalating criminal behavior, and he'd documented it all, keeping evidence that would eventually destroy us. The prosecutor asked why he'd started recording us. Julian said he'd realized 6 months ago that our behavior was spiraling out of control and that someone needed to have proof when things inevitably went wrong. He'd hoped he'd never have to use the evidence, that we'd mature or get scared or somehow stop on our own. But when Haley overdosed, he'd known the recordings were necessary to ensure accountability for what we'd done. The prosecutor asked if he regretted covering for us all those years. Julian finally looked directly at me for the first time since taking the stand. He said he regretted every single lie he'd told, every alibi he'd provided, every time he'd helped us avoid consequences. He'd enabled us to hurt people, to destroy property, to sell drugs that nearly killed a teenage girl. He'd betrayed his own parents' trust and obstructed justice repeatedly. His guilt was enormous, and he'd spend the rest of his life trying to make amends for the damage he'd helped cause. After Julian's testimony, the prosecutor called several other witnesses. Homeowners whose vacation properties we'd destroyed. They showed photos of the damage, described coming home to find thousands of dollars in furniture ruined, walls spray-painted with obscene graffiti, valuables stolen. One couple testified about their daughter's bedroom being completely trashed. The woman cried, describing how her 7-year-old had refused to sleep in her own room for months after seeing the destruction. Another witness was a parent whose son had overdosed on pills Dylan sold him. The boy survived, but had been in the hospital for a week. The father testified that they'd had no idea where the drugs came from until Julian's confession led police to our operation. Haley Cross's mother took the stand and described finding her daughter unconscious, calling 911, riding in the ambulance while her daughter's lips turned blue from lack of oxygen. Haley had survived, but had suffered brain damage from oxygen deprivation. She'd need ongoing therapy and might never fully recover. Her mother said she was grateful to Julian for finally telling the truth, because at least now they knew who to hold accountable. She looked directly at Dylan and said she hoped he understood the severity of what he'd done to her daughter. The evidence was overwhelming. By the end of the preliminary hearing, it was clear that fighting these charges would be pointless. Gregory advised me to cooperate with prosecutors and negotiate a plea deal that might reduce my sentence from decades to years. I met with the district attorney, a woman named Carla Fleming, who'd built her career prosecuting drug crimes. She laid out exactly what she could prove against me. Multiple break-ins with my fingerprints inside the houses, video evidence of me participating in drug transactions, text messages to Julian asking him to provide alibis. She said I'd participated in at least 15 different break-ins and had been present for numerous drug sales, including sales to minors. The sentencing guidelines were harsh. If I went to trial and lost, which seemed inevitable, I'd be facing 20 to 30 years in prison. She offered a deal: plead guilty to reduced charges, testify against Dylan regarding the fentanyl sales, and cooperate fully with restitution to the victims. In exchange, she'd recommend a sentence of 7 years with possibility of parole after 5. I'd also have to pay back every dollar in damages we'd caused, which totaled over $400,000 based on insurance claims and property assessments. My parents would have to help with restitution because I had no assets of my own. Caleb and Mira were offered similar deals. Mira accepted immediately, her attorney advising that fighting would only result in longer sentences. She pleaded guilty to breaking and entering and property destruction, got 6 years with parole eligibility after 4. Caleb held out longer, his parents convinced they could fight the charges. But when the prosecutor showed them the evidence Julian had provided, they realized they had no defense. Caleb pleaded guilty and got 8 years because of a prior juvenile record for vandalism. Dylan refused to cooperate. His attorney filed motions to suppress Julian's evidence, arguing it was obtained illegally. The judge denied every motion. Dylan's trial was scheduled for 6 months out, and prosecutors were planning to seek the maximum sentence because of his direct connection to Haley's overdose and his attempt to flee. The restitution process was devastating for my parents. They'd worked their entire lives building a business and saving for retirement. Now they were liquidating assets to pay for the damage I'd caused. The $400,000 in restitution was divided among the 4 of us based on our level of participation in each incident. My share was $127,000. My parents sold their vacation home and cashed out retirement accounts to cover it. The emotional cost was even higher than the financial one. I watched my parents age 10 years in the months between my arrest and sentencing. Julian's sentencing hearing happened first because he'd pleaded guilty as part of his cooperation agreement. I attended even though my attorney advised against it. I needed to see what happened to him, needed to understand why he'd finally broken after years of covering for us. The courtroom was smaller than the one where we'd had our preliminary hearing. Julian sat at the defendant's table wearing a suit, his parents on one side and his attorney on the other. His parents looked destroyed, their perfect son revealed to have been lying to them for 4 years. The prosecutor asked for probation rather than prison time given Julian's cooperation and the fact that he'd come forward voluntarily. Julian's attorney argued that his client had been manipulated by us, that he'd been too young to understand the full consequences of his actions. But the judge wasn't entirely sympathetic. She noted that Julian had been old enough to understand that lying to police and providing false alibis was obstruction of justice. She said his cooperation didn't erase the fact that he'd enabled serious criminal activity for years. His Stanford scholarship had been revoked the day after his arrest. His chances of attending any reputable university were essentially 0 with felony charges on his record. The judge sentenced him to 2 years in juvenile detention since he'd been 17 when most of the crimes occurred, followed by 3 years of probation. She also ordered community service and required him to speak at schools about the dangers of enabling destructive behavior in friends. After the sentencing, I waited outside the courthouse, hoping to talk to Julian. He came out with his parents, both of whom looked at me with undisguised hatred. Julian started to walk past me, but I stepped into his path and asked why he'd waited so long to tell the truth. He stopped and looked at me properly for the first time since his confession. His voice was flat when he said he'd been asking himself the same question every day since Haley's overdose. He'd been terrified of losing his friends, terrified of disappointing his parents, terrified of facing consequences. So he'd kept enabling us, kept lying, kept covering up our crimes even as they got worse and more dangerous. He'd convinced himself he could control the situation, that his alibis and cover stories were somehow protecting us from ourselves. But all he'd really done was make it possible for us to hurt more people without getting caught. When Haley nearly died, he'd realized his silence and his lies had been just as damaging as our actions. He'd destroyed his own future along with ours by finally telling the truth, but at least no one else would get hurt because of his enabling. I asked if he hated us now. Julian considered the question for a moment. He said he didn't hate us, but he didn't forgive us either. We'd used his trustworthiness and his loyalty as a weapon, had exploited his need to be helpful until it destroyed both him and the people we'd hurt. He'd spent 4 years protecting us from consequences, and the result was catastrophic for everyone involved. My sentencing happened 3 months later. The courtroom was packed with victims wanting to see justice served. I pleaded guilty as negotiated, and the judge heard impact statements from the homeowners whose properties we'd destroyed, from parents whose children had bought drugs from us, from Haley's mother, who described her daughter's ongoing recovery from brain damage. Each statement was harder to hear than the last. These were real people whose lives we'd damaged for entertainment and profit. My attorney presented my cooperation with prosecutors and my willingness to pay restitution as mitigating factors. My parents testified about my remorse and my commitment to making amends. But the judge was unmoved. She said I'd been an adult for the past year and had continued committing crimes even after turning 18. She noted that I'd exploited Julian's loyalty and trustworthiness to avoid accountability for years. She sentenced me to 9 years in prison, more than the 7 years recommended by prosecutors. She explained that leadership in a criminal enterprise deserved enhanced punishment, and evidence showed I'd been a primary organizer of our break-ins and party operation. I'd also been present for multiple drug sales to minors, which warranted additional time. With good behavior, I might be eligible for parole after 7 years. But I'd be 27 years old before I'd have any chance of freedom. My mother collapsed in the gallery when the sentence was read. My father held her while she sobbed, and I was led away in handcuffs before I could say goodbye. Prison was exactly as terrible as expected. I was processed into a medium security facility 3 hours from home, issued a uniform, and assigned to a cell with a roommate serving 15 years for armed robbery. The first month was survival, learning the social dynamics, staying out of conflicts, figuring out how to pass time when every day felt identical to the last. My parents visited monthly, the visits awkward and painful. They'd update me on their struggles with the business, on the ongoing restitution payments, on news from home. They never said they forgave me, and I never asked them to. I'd destroyed their retirement and their reputation in our community. Forgiveness wasn't something I could reasonably expect. Caleb ended up in the same facility after his sentencing. We didn't speak. Mira was sent to a women's facility across the state. Dylan's trial resulted in a conviction on all charges. He got 23 years because of the fentanyl connection and his flight attempt. He'd be nearly 45 when he was eligible for parole. Haley Cross made a partial recovery. Her mother sent a letter to the prison that the chaplain delivered to me. She wanted me to know that Haley had regained most of her cognitive function, but still struggled with memory problems and processing speed. She'd never be able to attend a normal college or pursue the career she'd planned. Her life had been permanently altered by the pills Dylan sold her, pills I'd helped him obtain and distribute. Her mother said she'd forgiven us because her faith required it, but forgiveness didn't mean she'd forgotten what we'd done to her daughter. Julian wrote to me 6 months into my sentence. I was surprised to receive the letter since I'd assumed he wanted nothing to do with any of us. But his letter explained that his therapist had suggested writing to each of us as part of his processing of guilt and trauma. He described his time in juvenile detention, which had been relatively mild compared to adult prison. He'd been released after 18 months for good behavior and was now working at a nonprofit that helped kids avoid the kind of destructive choices we'd made. He'd enrolled in community college with plans to eventually finish his degree, though Stanford was permanently out of reach. His relationship with his parents was slowly rebuilding, though they'd never fully trust him again. He said the hardest part was living with the knowledge that his lies had enabled so much damage. Every time he heard about a teen overdose or a break-in, he wondered if something similar would have been prevented if he'd told the truth sooner. He'd spent years trying to help us avoid consequences, and the result was that consequences became catastrophic when they finally arrived. He asked me to think carefully about the pattern we'd established, about how we'd used his kindness and reliability as a shield for our cruelty and selfishness. He said he hoped I'd emerge from prison as someone capable of real accountability, not just someone who'd learned to avoid getting caught. I wrote back asking Julian what had finally made him tell the truth after so many years of covering for us. Why Haley's overdose was the breaking point when he'd watched us hurt so many others. His response came 3 weeks later. He explained that Haley's overdose had been the culmination of years of escalating harm, but it wasn't the only reason. He'd been documenting our crimes for months, wrestling with whether to come forward. What finally pushed him to confess was a conversation with Haley's younger sister at a school volunteer event. The girl had been crying about her sister being in the hospital, about not understanding how Haley had gotten the drugs that nearly killed her. Julian had realized in that moment that his silence was protecting us while Haley's family suffered without answers. His loyalty to us had become more important than protecting innocent people from harm we were causing. That realization had broken something in him. He'd gone home that night, looked at the evidence he'd collected, and known he couldn't keep covering for us. Not anymore. Not when people were being genuinely damaged by our actions and his lies. So he'd called the police and our parents and confessed everything, knowing it would destroy his own life along with ours. But at least the truth would be known. At least families like Haley's would have answers and accountability. I served 7 years before becoming eligible for parole. My hearing included testimony from victims and prosecutors arguing about whether I'd genuinely changed or just learned to perform remorse. Haley's mother attended and spoke about the ongoing impact of her daughter's brain damage. My parents testified about the restitution they'd paid and my cooperation with authorities. The parole board approved my release with strict conditions: 3 years of intensive supervision, mandatory drug testing, community service requirements, and a prohibition on contacting Julian, Caleb, Mira, or Dylan without explicit permission. I walked out of prison at 27 years old with no job prospects, no degree, and a felony record that would follow me forever. My parents picked me up, and we drove home in silence. The house was smaller than I remembered. They'd downsized during my incarceration, selling our family home to cover restitution payments and attorney fees. Everything they'd built had been liquidated to pay for my crimes. I moved into their spare bedroom and started applying for jobs that would hire someone with my record. The work available was manual labor, minimum wage, nothing resembling the future I'd imagined before my arrest. But I wasn't entitled to the future I destroyed through my own choices. I attended mandated therapy sessions where a counselor helped me process guilt and shame. I volunteered at addiction recovery programs, met people whose lives had been destroyed by the same kinds of drugs we'd sold, heard their stories about overdoses and incarcerations and families torn apart. Every story reminded me of Haley Cross and the casual cruelty of our operation. 2 years after my release, I saw Julian at a community event. He was speaking to high school students about the dangers of enabling destructive behavior in friends, about the importance of telling the truth even when it's terrifying. I sat in the back and listened to him describe his experience. He talked about how he'd spent 4 years covering for friends who were hurting people, about how his lies had made him complicit in serious harm. He explained that he'd finally confessed because someone had nearly died, but that he should have come forward years earlier. He told the students that being a good friend didn't mean protecting people from consequences. Real friendship meant helping people face the results of their actions before those results became catastrophic. He described his own punishment and the ways his life had been permanently altered by his choices. His message was that silence in the face of wrongdoing makes you responsible for the harm that follows. After his presentation, I waited while students asked questions. When the room cleared, I approached him and asked if we could talk. He studied my face for a long moment before nodding. We walked to a coffee shop nearby and sat across from each other for the first time since my sentencing hearing. I apologized for using him, for exploiting his trust and his reliability to commit crimes that hurt innocent people. Julian listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said he appreciated the apology, but had spent years understanding that our exploitation of him had only worked because he'd allowed it. He'd enabled us because it gave him purpose and control in a life that otherwise felt suffocating. His guilt wasn't just about the lies he told, but about the fact that he'd known we were hurting people and had chosen our friendship over doing what was right. He'd finally told the truth, not because he'd become brave, but because a girl nearly died and he couldn't live with his silence anymore. That didn't make him heroic, just finally honest about the damage we'd all caused together. We'd both have to live with those choices forever, and no amount of apologizing would change what we'd done. 3 years after my release, Haley Cross agreed to meet with me as part of a restorative justice program. We sat in a mediation room with a facilitator, and I listened while Haley described the past decade of her life. The brain damage from her overdose had left her with processing difficulties and memory problems that would never fully resolve. She'd finished high school with accommodations, but couldn't attend college. She worked part-time at a grocery store doing tasks that didn't require complex thinking. She'd lost the future she'd planned, the dreams she'd had, because she'd taken pills from Dylan that nearly killed her. She wanted me to understand that my crimes hadn't been victimless, that selling drugs and throwing parties in other people's homes had real consequences for real people. I apologized and meant it, but words felt inadequate. Haley said she'd forgiven us because holding on to anger was destroying her more than it hurt us. But forgiveness didn't erase what we'd done or restore what she'd lost. After the meeting, the facilitator asked if I understood the full impact of my actions. I said yes. That meeting Haley and hearing directly how we'd damaged her life had made everything real in a way prison hadn't. The facilitator explained that accountability meant more than serving time and paying restitution. It meant truly understanding the harm caused and working to ensure similar harm never happened again. 10 years after Julian confessed, I attended his wedding. He'd invited me surprisingly, saying that part of his healing involved reconnecting with his past while not being defined by it. He'd finished his degree in social work and was working with at-risk youth, helping them avoid the destructive patterns we'd fallen into. His fiancée knew everything about his history and had helped him process his guilt and shame. At the reception, we talked about what the past decade had taught us. Julian said telling the truth had destroyed his planned future, but had given him a different life that felt more authentic and meaningful. He'd lost Stanford and his perfect record, but he'd gained the ability to help people who were making similar mistakes. He said he'd finally stopped defining himself as the person who'd covered for us or the person who'd betrayed us. He was just Julian now, someone who'd made terrible choices at 17 and had spent the next decade trying to build something better. When Julian's father gave a toast at the reception, he mentioned that his son had taught him that truth was more valuable than reputation, that real love meant letting people face consequences rather than enabling their worst impulses. Watching Julian's parents accept him despite everything filled me with a grief I couldn't name. My own parents had forgiven me on some level, but our relationship would never recover from what I'd put them through. The trust was permanently broken, the love conditional in ways it hadn't been before my arrest. That was a consequence I'd live with forever, more painful than any prison sentence. 15 years after Julian's confession, I spoke at a high school assembly about the consequences of criminal behavior. I stood where Julian had stood years earlier and told students about how 4 friends had exploited one person's trustworthiness until it enabled years of destructive crime. I described breaking into homes and throwing parties that destroyed families' property. I explained how we'd sold drugs that nearly killed a teenage girl. I talked about the prison sentence, the restitution that bankrupted my parents, the permanent damage to my relationship with them. But mostly, I talked about Julian, about how his decision to finally tell the truth had been the hardest and most important choice any of us had made. Because his confession had ended our criminal operation before we killed someone. His lies had enabled us for years, but his truth had saved us from becoming murderers. I told the students that real friendship wasn't about covering for people or helping them avoid consequences. Real friendship was telling the truth, even when it destroyed relationships, even when it meant losing everything. Julian had done that for us, and while we'd all paid enormous prices, we'd paid less than we would have if he'd stayed silent and let us continue until someone died. After my presentation, a student asked if I'd forgiven Julian for telling our parents everything. I said there was nothing to forgive. Julian had done the right thing, just 4 years too late. The person who needed forgiving was me, for putting him in a position where he had to choose between his loyalty to us and his moral obligation to stop protecting people who were hurting others. And Julian called me on the anniversary of his confession, a ritual we'd maintained for years. We talked about where we were now versus where we'd been. He'd recently been promoted at his nonprofit and was developing programs to help teens recognize and resist peer pressure that led to criminal behavior. I'd finally finished my college degree online and was working as a counselor for formerly incarcerated people trying to rebuild their lives. Neither of us had the futures we'd imagined at 17, but we'd built something meaningful from the wreckage. Julian asked if I ever regretted getting caught, if I wished he'd just kept covering for us. I said no, that getting caught had been the only thing that stopped us from escalating further. We'd been on a path towards seriously hurting or killing someone, and his confession had ended that trajectory. He said he still wrestled with guilt about enabling us for so long, about all the people who'd been hurt because he'd stayed silent. I told him what my therapist had told me. Guilt was appropriate, but it had to lead somewhere productive rather than just being self-destructive punishment. We'd both caused serious harm, we'd both faced consequences, and now we were both trying to prevent similar harm from happening to others. That was the only real redemption available. Not forgiveness or forgetting, but genuine commitment to being better and helping others avoid our mistakes. Before we hung up, Julian said something that stayed with me. He said the friend who lied to our parents for years finally told them the truth when the cost of lying became greater than the cost of honesty. Not because he'd become brave or righteous, but because a girl nearly died and he couldn't carry that weight anymore. His confession hadn't been heroic, just desperately necessary. And if any good had come from the disaster of our teenage years, it was that we'd both learned the difference between loyalty that protects and loyalty that enables harm. We'd learned it far too late to prevent the damage we caused, but at least we'd learned it at all. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.